The champagne glass slipped from my fingers and shattered against the marble floor of the country club ballroom. But it wasn't the crash that made everyone turn and stare. It was what my father had just said to the circle of wealthy guests surrounding him. "Oh, that's just Meredith. She's a cleaner. Nothing important." Those words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there in my second-hand dress, watching my own father dismiss 26 years of my existence to impress people who wouldn't remember his name tomorrow. The woman in the Hermes dress actually laughed, a tinkling, cruel sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who are supposed to love you, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened next changed everything, and I need you to stay with me for this entire story. Trust me, my father's about to learn exactly what happens when you underestimate someone you've spent a lifetime crushing. I wasn't supposed to be at this wedding. Hell, I wasn't even supposed to know about it. My half-sister Vivian, Daddy's precious princess from his second marriage, had made it crystal clear that I wasn't welcome at her fairy tale day. But my stepmother Patricia had different plans. She wanted me there as unpaid help, setting up chairs, cleaning bathrooms, making sure everything was perfect for her daughter's $100,000 celebration. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Vivian floated around in her custom Vera Wang gown, I was literally on my hands and knees that morning, scrubbing toilets in the same venue where she'd say her vows. Patricia had handed me a uniform, actual cleaning supplies, and a hairnet, and told me to make myself useful for once. But here's what they didn't know. I had been working as a professional cleaner for the past 3 years. Not because I couldn't do anything else, but because I was building something. Every house I cleaned, every office building I maintained at 3 in the morning, every dollar I scraped together was funding my real dream. The dream they'd laughed at, dismissed, and tried to kill since I was 18 years old. My father, Richard Hartwell, owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across 3 states. Old money, new attitude, the kind of man who wore his success like armor and treated anyone beneath his tax bracket like they were disposable. When my mother died in a car accident when I was 15, he remarried Patricia within 8 months. Suddenly, I went from being his grieving daughter to being the unwanted reminder of his first life. The contrast was staggering. Vivian got private school, designer clothes, a trust fund, and a father who actually showed up to her events. I got community college if I could pay for it myself, hand-me-downs from Patricia's charity drives, and a father who acted like acknowledging my existence would somehow tarnish his reputation. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by 300 of the city's elite, I realized I had become exactly what he'd always seen me as, the help. The invisible daughter who cleaned up after everyone else's happiness. But as I bent to pick up the pieces of broken glass, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the way the woman in Hermes was still smirking at me, or how my father had already turned back to his conversation like I'd never even been there. Maybe it was seeing Vivian pose for photos with a father who'd never once taken a single picture with me. Or maybe it was remembering what was waiting for me at home, the acceptance letter I'd received just 3 days ago. The letter that would change everything if I was brave enough to use it. I'd been documenting my entire cleaning journey on social media for 2 years. What started as a way to find motivation and connect with other people working multiple jobs had grown into something I never expected. My TikTok account, @CleaningWithMeredith, had exploded over the past 6 months. Videos of me cleaning massive mansions, transforming disaster zones, sharing cleaning hacks and life advice. They were getting millions of views. The comments were incredible. People sharing their own struggles, thanking me for making them feel less alone, asking for advice about everything from stubborn stains to rebuilding their lives after divorce. I'd built a community of over 800,000 followers who saw me as someone who understood their daily battles. But my family had no idea. To them, I was still just the disappointment who couldn't get her life together. The daughter who embarrassed them by working with her hands instead of marrying rich like Vivian had. That acceptance letter at home? It was from a major streaming platform. They wanted to give me my own show, a reality series following my cleaning business as it expanded, featuring home makeovers and life transformations. The advance they were offering was more than my father made in 6 months. Standing there with glass cutting into my palms, I made a decision that would haunt him forever. I pulled out my phone and opened TikTok. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady as I hit record. Hey everyone, it's Meredith, and I'm currently at my half-sister's wedding where my father just told a room full of people that I'm just a cleaner, nothing important. I flipped the camera to show the opulent ballroom, then back to my face. So, I thought this might be a good time to share some exciting news. I could see people starting to notice me filming, confusion spreading across their Botoxed faces. My father was still deep in conversation, oblivious. 3 days ago, I got offered my own TV show. Netflix wants to give me $2 million to document my cleaning business and help transform people's lives. I paused, letting that sink in. But you know what? Maybe I'm just a cleaner. Maybe I'm nothing important. What do you think? Should I take the deal? I posted it immediately, then slipped out through the service entrance before anyone could process what had just happened. What I didn't expect was for that video to explode while the wedding was still going on. Within an hour, it had 50,000 views. Within 3 hours, it was trending. By the time the reception was in full swing, it had been shared by major cleaning accounts, lifestyle influencers, and even a few celebrities who'd seen it and were outraged on my behalf. My phone was buzzing nonstop with notifications, but I was already home, sitting on my tiny apartment floor, finally opening that acceptance letter and reading every beautiful word of my future. The next morning, my father called for the first time in 6 months. I let it go to voicemail. Then Patricia called. Then Vivian. Then my father again. I was too busy packing for Los Angeles to answer any of them. But this is just the beginning of how I made them realize exactly who they'd been overlooking all these years. Because what happened when I got to California and what I discovered about my father's business practices would give me the perfect opportunity for the sweetest revenge imaginable. The real game was just starting. 3 days later, I was on a plane to Los Angeles with a first-class ticket I'd never dreamed of affording, while my phone continued exploding with notifications that made my heart race with every ping. The original video had hit 3 million views. 3 million people had watched my father dismiss me as nothing important. The comment section was a war zone of support, outrage, and people sharing their own stories of family betrayal. But what really shocked me was who was paying attention. Cleaning companies across the country were reaching out, offering partnerships. Lifestyle brands wanted collaborations. Major podcasts were requesting interviews. Even Oprah's team had sent an email expressing interest in featuring my story. But the most satisfying notification came from my father himself, a text message that I screenshot before he could delete it. Meredith, we need to talk immediately. This is damaging our family's reputation. Delete that video now. Our family's reputation, not my feelings. Not his regret for humiliating me. Just damage control for the Hartwell name. I was laughing when Netflix executive producer Diana Chen called my phone. Meredith. Diana Chen here. I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. Have you seen what's happening online? I glanced at my follower count. It had jumped from 800,000 to 1.2 million overnight. I'm getting a pretty good idea. This changes everything. The original offer was for a small docuseries, but now we're looking at primetime reality. The audience response is unprecedented. People are emotionally invested in your story before we've even filmed a single episode. She paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. We want to triple the offer. $6 million for 3 seasons, plus profit sharing. But more importantly, we want to give you complete creative control. This isn't just about cleaning anymore. It's about transformation, resilience, and proving that everyone deserves respect regardless of their profession. $6 million. I had to sit down in the airport terminal, my head spinning. There's something else, Diana continued. We've been contacted by several major publications wanting exclusive interviews. Good Morning America, The Today Show, Ellen, they all want to talk to you about what happened at that wedding. The story is resonating with millions of people who felt undervalued by their own families. When I landed in LAX, there were actually photographers waiting. Not paparazzi, legitimate media outlets who'd somehow found out my flight information. The attention was surreal, but what struck me most was how respectful everyone was. They weren't treating me like a spectacle. They were treating me like someone whose story mattered. The Netflix offices were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hollywood Hills, modern art that probably cost more than I'd made in my entire life, and people in designer clothes who spoke with the kind of confidence that comes from working at the top of your industry. But Diana Chin was different. She was maybe 45, wore simple black jeans and a blazer, and when she shook my hand, she looked directly into my eyes like she was seeing me, really seeing me for the first time in years. "Before we talk contracts," she said, leading me into a conference room, "I want you to know why this story matters so much." My own father spent most of my childhood telling people I'd never amount to anything because I was just interested in television. He wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer, something respectable. It took me 20 years to prove that storytelling could change the world. She pulled up social media analytics on a massive screen. "Your video has been shared in 37 countries. It's been translated into 12 languages. We're seeing responses from people in rural farming communities, urban professionals, immigrants working multiple jobs to survive, kids from broken homes, everyone who's ever been made to feel small by someone who should love them unconditionally." The numbers were staggering, but what really got to me were the comments she showed me. People sharing photos of their own cleaning businesses, their side hustles, their dreams that family members had dismissed. Parents apologizing to their kids for not believing in them. Adult children finally standing up to toxic relatives. "This isn't just entertainment," Diana said. "This is a movement, and you're at the center of it." That's when she showed me something that made my blood run cold. "We also did some research on your father's business practices while preparing for the show. We always do background checks to avoid any legal issues, and we found some interesting information." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents I'd never seen before, financial records, employee testimonials, legal complaints that had been quietly settled out of court. Richard Hartwell, my father, had been systematically underpaying his cleaning and maintenance staff for over a decade. He'd been classifying full-time employees as part-time contractors to avoid paying benefits. Multiple women had filed complaints about unsafe working conditions, sexual harassment from management, and retaliation when they spoke up. The cherry on top? He'd been claiming massive tax deductions for charitable contributions by donating old company property at inflated values, while simultaneously cutting employee healthcare coverage to boost his profit margins. "The irony," Diana said quietly, "is that he's built his fortune partly by exploiting the exact type of worker he just publicly dismissed his own daughter as being." I stared at the documents, my hands trembling. All those years he'd made me feel worthless. All those times he'd acted like manual labor was beneath the Hartwell family name, and he'd been profiting off the backs of cleaners, maintenance workers, and service industry employees while treating them like garbage. "What are you going to do with this information?" I asked. Diana smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "That depends on you. We could include it in the show as part of your family's backstory, or we could keep it as background information only. But Meredith, there are over 300 current and former employees who have legitimate grievances against this company. Many of them have been watching your story unfold, and they're starting to reach out." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi Meredith, this is Carmen Rodriguez. I worked at your father's dealership in Phoenix until last year. I saw your video and wanted you to know you're not alone. He treated his employees the same way he treated you. If you're interested in hearing our stories, please call me." Then another. "Meredith, my name is James Washington. I was a mechanic at Hartwell Motors until I got injured, and they fired me instead of helping with workers' comp. Your father owes a lot of people more than just an apology." And another. "This is Sarah Kim, former office manager in Denver. I have documentation of illegal payroll practices if you ever need it. What you said about being just a cleaner made me cry because that's exactly how he made all of us feel." I looked up at Diana, who was watching my face carefully. "How many people have reached out?" "As of this morning? 47 current and former employees across all 3 states where his dealerships operate. plus 12 vendors who say they were stiffed on payments, and 8 customers who filed complaints with the Better Business Bureau that were mysteriously resolved without any actual resolution. The weight of it hit me all at once. This wasn't just about my personal revenge anymore. This was about justice for dozens of people who'd been crushed under my father's need to maintain his image of success. "There's something else," Diana said, pulling up another screen. "Your TikTok video caught the attention of investigative journalist Rebecca Martinez from the Los Angeles Times. She's been working on a series about wage theft in family-owned businesses. She wants to interview you, but more importantly, she wants to investigate your father's companies." I thought about that little girl who used to wait by the window for her daddy to come home from work, who believed he was a hero because he wore expensive suits and drove fancy cars. I thought about the teenager who'd been told her dreams weren't worth investing in, who'd been made to feel grateful for hand-me-downs while her half-sister got trust funds. I thought about Carmen Rodriguez and James Washington and Sarah Kim, people I'd never met who'd been treated exactly like I had, except they didn't have the luxury of walking away because they needed those paychecks to survive. "Set up the interview," I said. "All of them. And Diana? I want that investigation to be part of the show. I want people to see what really happens when someone decides their success is more important than treating people with basic human dignity." She nodded slowly. "This is going to get ugly, Meredith. Your father won't take this quietly. Neither will your stepmother or half-sister. Are you prepared for that?" I looked out the window at the Los Angeles skyline, thinking about how far I'd come from that girl cleaning toilets in a country club bathroom while her family celebrated without her. You know what? I've been preparing for this my whole life. I just didn't know it yet. But I had no idea how prepared my father had been for war, or what he was willing to do to protect his empire. The phone calls I'd been ignoring were just the beginning. What happened next would test everything I thought I knew about the man who'd raised me and reveal secrets that would shake our family and his business to its foundation. The real battle was about to begin. Rebecca Martinez was nothing like I expected an investigative journalist to be. Instead of the hard-edged reporter from movies, she was soft-spoken with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the type of person you'd instinctively trust with your deepest secrets. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what made her so dangerous to people like my father. We met at a small cafe in Santa Monica, away from the Netflix offices and media attention. She'd already been investigating wage theft across California for 6 months when my viral video landed on her desk. "Your timing was perfect," she said, pulling out a recorder and notebook. "I've been trying to get former employees of family-owned businesses to go on record for months. Most are too scared of retaliation. But your video gave them hope that someone from inside these families might actually fight back." She showed me a thick folder of testimonials, financial records, and legal documents that made my stomach turn. My father's business practices weren't just unethical, they were potentially criminal. "The pattern is consistent across all 3 locations," Rebecca explained. "Employees hired as full-time, then systematically moved to part-time hours to avoid benefit payments. Overtime deliberately miscalculated. Safety equipment requests denied, then employees fired for insubordination when they complained. And the women." She paused, her jaw tightening. "The sexual harassment complaints were always settled with NDAs and small payouts that these families couldn't afford to refuse." I thought about all the times my father had come home complaining about ungrateful employees and people who didn't want to work hard. Now I understood what he really meant, people who dared to expect fair treatment. "But here's what's really interesting," Rebecca continued, pulling out her laptop. "Your father's financial records show something unusual. 3 years ago, his profit margins increased dramatically, but not from increased sales. The boost came entirely from reduced labor costs and benefit savings. Right around the time, he started the aggressive reclassification of employees." She turned the screen toward me, showing a graph that made the timeline crystal clear. "Do you know what else happened 3 years ago in your father's personal life?" I thought back, my heart sinking as I realized. That's when Vivian got engaged. When they started planning this massive wedding.
Exactly.
Your half-sister's wedding cost approximately $90,000, according to the venue contracts we've obtained. Your stepmother's kitchen renovation was another 40,000. The new boat your father bought was 65,000. All funded by money that should have gone to employee wages and health care benefits. The math was sickening. My family's lifestyle upgrades had been paid for by stealing from working families, people with kids, mortgages, medical bills they couldn't afford. There's more, Rebecca said. We've traced some concerning connections between your father's dealerships and a network of other family businesses using similar practices. They share the same employment attorney, the same payroll processing company, and they've all adopted identical policies for reclassifying workers. This isn't just one bad businessman. It's a coordinated effort to exploit employees across multiple industries. My phone had been buzzing constantly during our conversation. When I finally looked, I saw 17 missed calls from my father, 12 from Patricia, and a string of increasingly frantic text messages from Vivian. The latest one from my father read, "Meredith, whatever lies people are telling you, remember that I'm your family. Don't destroy everything we've built over some internet attention." Everything we've built. As if I'd had any part in building his empire of exploitation. Rebecca noticed my expression. They've been trying to reach you? Constantly. My father keeps talking about family loyalty and not believing lies from disgruntled employees. That's exactly what we expected. Here's what usually happens next. They'll try to discredit you personally. Then they'll attempt to silence the employees who've come forward. And finally, they'll claim any documentation we have is fabricated or taken out of context. She wasn't wrong. That afternoon, I got a call from Diana at Netflix with disturbing news. Someone called claiming to represent your family's legal team, Diana said. They're threatening to sue us for defamation if we move forward with including any business practices in your show. They're also claiming you've signed some kind of family confidentiality agreement that prevents you from discussing private family matters publicly. I laughed, but it wasn't funny. What confidentiality agreement? The one where he pretended I didn't exist for the past 8 years. That's what we figured, but they're also making some personal accusations. They claim you've been stealing from them, that you're a drug addict, that you're mentally unstable and prone to fabricating stories for attention. The attacks felt like physical blows, but I wasn't surprised. This was exactly how my father operated. If he couldn't control the narrative, he'd destroy the messenger. Diana, I need you to know something. Every single allegation they're making is a lie, and I can prove it. I've been drug tested for multiple cleaning contracts with government buildings. I've never stolen so much as a paperclip from anyone. And my mental health records will show that the only therapy I've ever needed was to deal with family trauma. We believe you completely, she said. But they're going to make this as ugly as possible. Are you prepared for them to air every private family moment, every teenage mistake, every vulnerable detail of your life? I thought about the employees who were risking their livelihoods to speak out, people who had so much more to lose than I did. Let them try. I've got nothing to hide, and apparently they've got everything to hide. That evening, I was in my hotel room preparing for the first day of filming when Vivian called. For the first time since everything started, I decided to answer. "Meredith, thank God," she said, her voice shaky. "We need to talk. This is getting out of hand." Really? What part is out of hand, Vivian? The part where I'm finally successful, or the part where your lifestyle is built on stolen wages? That's not. Look, I don't know anything about Dad's business practices, okay? I just know that people are saying horrible things about our family online, and Mom is having panic attacks, and Dad is talking about selling the dealerships because the negative publicity is ruining everything. Good, I said, and meant it. Maybe he should have thought about that before he built his fortune by exploiting people. But what about us? What about Mom and me? We didn't do anything wrong. The audacity was stunning. Vivian, you've spent the last 8 years enjoying the benefits of that exploitation. Your wedding, your designer clothes, your trust fund. Where do you think that money came from? And now you want me to protect you from the consequences? I'm your sister. No, I said, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders as I spoke the truth. You're the daughter of the woman who married my father for his money and convinced him to write me out of his will. You're the half-sister who made it clear I wasn't welcome at your wedding unless I was cleaning toilets. You're the family member who stood there and watched him dismiss me as nothing important without saying a word. She was crying now, but I felt nothing. Meredith, please. I'm begging you. If you do this investigation, it's going to destroy everything. Dad's already talking about bankruptcy lawyers. Then maybe he should have paid his employees fairly instead of funding your fairy tale life. I hung up and immediately called Rebecca Martinez. The intimidation tactics have started, I told her. They're threatening lawsuits, making personal attacks, and now they're trying the guilt manipulation. My half-sister just called crying about how this is going to destroy everything. Perfect, Rebecca said, and I could hear her typing. That tells me they know we're onto something big. Meredith, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've learned that the louder they scream about their reputation, the more they have to hide. Your father just made a crucial mistake. What mistake? He told your half-sister that he might have to declare bankruptcy. That's an admission that his business model was unsustainable without exploiting employees. And bankruptcy proceedings are public record. We'll have access to every financial document he's been hiding. As I fell asleep that night, I realized that my father's biggest weakness had always been his pride. He'd rather risk everything than admit he was wrong. And that pride was about to be his downfall. But what happened over the next few days would prove that Richard Hartwell wasn't going down without a fight, and he was willing to use weapons I never could have imagined. The war was escalating, and I was about to learn that sometimes the people you love most are capable of the deepest betrayal. I should have known my father wouldn't fight fair. Richard Hartwell had built his empire on manipulation, intimidation, and carefully constructed lies. When legal threats and family guilt didn't work, he switched to a strategy that cut deeper than any lawsuit ever could. It started with a call from my apartment complex in Chicago. Ms. Hartwell? This is Janet from Maple Grove Management. We've received some disturbing information about your tenancy. We need to discuss your lease agreement immediately. My blood ran cold. I'd been a model tenant for 3 years, paid early, never complained, even helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. What kind of information? We've been contacted by someone claiming to be your family member, expressing concern about your mental health and financial stability. They've provided documentation suggesting you may have been involved in fraudulent activities and that you're currently under investigation by law enforcement. The room started spinning. That's completely false. Who called you? I'm not at liberty to say, but they seemed very concerned about your well-being. They mentioned you've been making false accusations against family members online and suggested you might be experiencing a psychological break. My father had weaponized my own home against me. Within hours, I received similar calls from my bank, my insurance company, and even my phone provider. Someone had launched a systematic campaign to destroy my credibility and financial stability. But the cruelest attack came that afternoon, when Diana from Netflix called with devastation in her voice. Meredith, someone sent the network a package of documents claiming to be from your medical records. They show multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, drug treatment programs, and a diagnosis of severe personality disorder with delusional episodes. Diana, those records are completely fabricated. I've never been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons, never been in drug treatment, never been diagnosed with any personality disorder. We know that now, but it took our legal team 6 hours to verify they were forgeries. Professional-grade forgeries, Meredith. Someone spent serious money to make these look authentic. The sophistication of the attack was terrifying. This wasn't desperate flailing, it was calculated warfare. There's more, Diana continued. Someone also leaked your personal information to several gossip blogs. They're running stories about your troubled past and questioning whether Netflix should be giving a platform to someone who's clearly unstable. I pulled up the articles on my phone, my hands shaking as I read headlines like Netflix star's dark secret, family says she's delusional, and cleaning lady or con artist. The truth about viral wedding video. The comments sections were brutal. People who'd supported me just days before were now questioning everything, wondering if my father had been right to dismiss me, speculating about what really happened at the wedding. My follower count on TikTok started dropping. Brands began canceling partnership deals. The wave of support that had felt so powerful just a week ago was crumbling under the weight of manufactured doubt. That's when Rebecca Martinez called with the news that changed everything. "Meredith, I've been digging into who's behind these attacks, and you're not going to believe what I found." She traced the forged medical records to a private investigation firm specializing in reputation management for wealthy families. The same firm had connections to the gossip blogs running hit pieces about me, and their client list included several other family-owned businesses currently under investigation for labor violations. "Your father didn't just hire lawyers," Rebecca said. "He hired a company that specializes in destroying whistleblowers. They've used these exact tactics against employees who've tried to speak out against other clients." The realization hit me like ice water. He's done this before. Multiple times. And here's the most damaging part. They're very good at what they do. Most people who face this level of attack either give up or have mental health crises that actually require hospitalization, which then validates the false claims they planted. My father wasn't just trying to silence me. He was trying to drive me to an actual breakdown that would prove his lies. It was psychological warfare designed to make fiction become reality. But Rebecca had more news that would flip the script entirely. However, they made one crucial mistake. The investigation firm keeps detailed records of their campaigns, and we've found a way to access their files through a former employee who's been documenting their illegal activities. "Meredith, we have evidence of everything. The forged documents, the coordinated attacks, the client communications authorizing character assassination." "What does that mean?" "It means your father just committed multiple felonies. Document forgery, identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and potentially criminal harassment. And we can prove he orchestrated all of it." That afternoon, I sat in the Netflix conference room surrounded by lawyers, executives, and Rebecca Martinez, planning the most important decision of my life. "We can go two ways," explained senior legal counsel Marcus Webb. "We can take this evidence to the district attorney and pursue criminal charges, which would likely result in your father facing years in prison. Or we can use it as leverage to ensure he stops the attacks and pays restitution to his employees without admitting criminal wrongdoing." I thought about the man who used to read me bedtime stories, who taught me to ride a bike, who'd once told me I could be anything I wanted in life. But that man had died years ago, replaced by someone who would forge psychiatric records to destroy his own daughter's reputation. "There's a third option," I said quietly. "We expose everything publicly, but we do it in a way that focuses on the employees he's hurt, not just on revenge against him." Rebecca smiled. "What are you thinking?" The Netflix show becomes an investigation documentary. We interview the employees, show the evidence of wage theft and the cover-up attempts, and let the audience see exactly how these powerful families operate when they're threatened. My personal story becomes the entry point for a much bigger conversation about worker exploitation. Diana was nodding enthusiastically. "It's brilliant. Instead of a reality show about your cleaning business, we create a documentary series about fighting back against workplace abuse. Your transformation becomes the catalyst for helping other people find their voice." Marcus looked concerned. "That's admirable, but you understand the risks? Your father will face criminal prosecution, your family relationships will be permanently destroyed, and you'll be the target of intense scrutiny and probably more attacks." I thought about Carmen Rodriguez, James Washington, Sarah Kim, and 44 other employees who'd been cheated out of wages while my family lived in luxury. I thought about the investigation firm's other victims, people who'd been destroyed so thoroughly they'd never recovered. "You know what the real risk is?" I said. "The risk is doing nothing and letting him keep hurting people. He just proved he's willing to forge medical records and try to drive his own daughter to a mental breakdown to protect his profits. What do you think he'd do to employees who can't afford lawyers or media attention?" That evening, I called a press conference that would change everything. Standing in front of cameras from major news networks, I held up copies of the forged psychiatric records and the evidence linking them to my father's hired attack dogs. "My name is Meredith Hartwell, and for the past week, my father has been trying to convince the world that I'm mentally ill, drug-addicted, and delusional. He's been doing this because I dare to speak out about how he treats his employees, the same way he's treated me my entire adult life." I looked directly into the cameras. But tonight, I want to talk about the 47 current and former employees of Hartwell Motors who've been stolen from, harassed, and silenced. People like Carmen Rodriguez, who was fired after reporting sexual harassment. Like James Washington, who was denied workers' compensation after a job-related injury. Like Sarah Kim, who has documentation proving systematic payroll fraud. The questions from reporters were intense, but I was ready for all of them. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't standing alone against my father's manipulation. I had evidence, allies, and most importantly, I had the truth. What I didn't expect was the phone call that came at midnight, from a number I didn't recognize but a voice that made my blood freeze. Congratulations, Meredith. You've just destroyed your entire family over a bunch of ungrateful employees who were lucky to have jobs at all. It was my father, and he sounded different. Not angry or desperate, but coldly calculated in a way that terrified me more than any of his previous attacks. But if you think this ends with some documentary and news coverage, you're more naive than I thought. I built this empire from nothing, and I'm not letting some self-righteous little girl tear it down. You want a war? You'll get one. The line went dead, and I realized that everything we'd uncovered so far was just the tip of the iceberg. My father had spent decades perfecting the art of destroying people who threatened him, and I just made myself his primary target. The next morning, I woke up to find my story on the front page of the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and USA Today. Rebecca's investigation had gone national overnight, with headlines like "Family Business Empire Built on Wage Theft" and "Daughter Exposes Father's Systematic Worker Exploitation." But what really shook me was the email waiting in my inbox from someone I'd never expected to hear from, my father's former business partner, Michael Chin. "Meredith, I saw your press conference last night. We need to talk immediately. Your father is more dangerous than you realize, and there are things about his business practices that go far beyond wage theft. I have recordings." Michael had been my father's partner for the first 10 years of the dealership business, before they'd had what I was told was an amicable split. Now, sitting across from me in a downtown LA diner, he looked like a man who'd been carrying a terrible secret for too long. "Your father didn't just steal from employees," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He stole from me, from investors, from insurance companies, and from the government. I've been waiting 15 years for someone with the courage to expose him." He pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind investigators use for undercover work. "I started recording our conversations when I suspected he was hiding assets during our partnership dissolution. What I captured was much worse than financial fraud." The first recording made my stomach turn. It was my father's voice, clear as day, talking to someone about manipulating accident reports to avoid insurance payouts. "Just make sure the paperwork shows driver error, not mechanical failure. We can't have another lawsuit over the brake issue. The family will take the insurance settlement and keep quiet. They need the money too badly to fight us in court." Michael fast-forwarded to another section. "This one is from 2018. Listen carefully." My father's voice again. "The girl filed another harassment complaint against Davidson. Just like the others, we'll offer her $10,000 to sign an NDA and disappear. If she won't take it, we'll make her life difficult until she quits. Davidson brings in too much revenue to lose over some secretary's hurt feelings." I had to excuse myself to throw up in the bathroom. When I returned, Michael was watching me with sad, knowing eyes. "There are hours of these recordings, Meredith. Your father has been systematically covering up safety violations, sexual harassment, insurance fraud, and tax evasion for over 20 years. I estimate he's stolen close to $3 million from various sources. Why didn't you come forward before?" Michael's laugh was bitter. "I tried once, in 2010. Suddenly, the IRS was auditing my personal taxes. My new business was having mysterious permit problems, and my ex-wife was getting anonymous calls claiming I was abusing our children. It took me 2 years and $50,000 in legal fees to clear my name. The same pattern. The same hired guns. My father had been destroying people who threatened him for decades. But when I saw you standing up to him last night," Michael continued, "I realized this might be the only chance to stop him. You have media attention, legal support, and most importantly, you're his daughter. Even he can't completely destroy you without destroying himself. That afternoon, Rebecca Martinez nearly fell out of her chair when I played her the recordings. Meredith, this isn't just employment law violations anymore. This is RICO territory, racketeering, conspiracy, systematic criminal enterprise. We're talking about federal charges that could put him away for 20 years. She immediately called her editor, who contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division. Within hours, federal agents were interviewing Michael Chun and reviewing his evidence. But while law enforcement was building their case, my father was launching his final, most vicious attack. It started with Vivian calling me, sobbing hysterically. Meredith, Mom is in the hospital. She had a heart attack this morning when the FBI agents showed up at the house with a search warrant. The doctors say it was stress-induced. My stepmother, Patricia, despite everything she'd done to me over the years, was still a human being. And despite my anger at my family, I didn't want anyone to die over this. Is she going to be okay? We don't know yet. But Dad says this is your fault. He says if Mom dies, it's because you couldn't let sleeping dogs lie. The manipulation was masterful, even in crisis. Somehow, my father's criminal behavior was my responsibility. But Vivian wasn't finished. There's something else. Dad showed me some things about you, Meredith. Photos and documents from when you were younger. He says if you don't call off this investigation, he's going to release them publicly. My blood went ice cold. What photos? From when you were having problems in high school. After Mom died. The cutting, the eating disorder, the time you tried to. She couldn't finish the sentence. My father was threatening to weaponize my teenage mental health crisis, the darkest period of my life, when I'd been consumed by grief and self-destruction after losing my mother. He'd kept evidence of my pain, my medical treatments, my most vulnerable moments, as ammunition for exactly this scenario. He has photos of my scars, of my medical records from when I was hospitalized. He says he saved everything in case he ever needed to prove you were unstable. Meredith, I'm begging you. Call off the investigation. We'll figure out some way to compensate the employees quietly, but please don't let him destroy you with this. I hung up and immediately called Diana at Netflix. He's escalating, I told her. My stepmother is in the hospital, and now he's threatening to release private medical information from when I was a minor dealing with trauma from my mother's death. Jesus Christ. That's not just character assassination. That's potentially criminal exploitation of a minor's medical records. But Meredith, I have to ask, are you prepared for those photos to become public? Because people like your father don't make empty threats. I thought about 16-year-old me, lost in grief and self-hatred, carving lines into my skin because physical pain felt easier to manage than emotional devastation. I thought about the scared, broken girl who'd been hospitalized 3 times before finding a therapist who helped her heal. Then I thought about the 47 employees whose stories had been drowned out by my family's drama. People who were still being cheated, still being harassed, still being silenced while I got to be the center of attention. Let him release them, I said. If he wants to show the world what he did to a grieving 16-year-old girl, let him. People will see exactly what kind of father he's always been. That night, as I prepared for what might be the worst public humiliation of my life, I got a call that changed everything. Meredith? This is Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, FBI White Collar Crime Division. We've been reviewing the evidence provided by Mr. Chun and by Ms. Martinez's investigation. I need you to know that we're moving forward with federal charges against your father, regardless of any personal attacks he may launch against you. Even if he releases private information about me? Especially if he does that. Using a minor's medical records as blackmail material would be additional federal charges. But more importantly, we have enough evidence to proceed without your testimony, if necessary. The other employees are cooperating, the financial evidence is solid, and Mr. Chen's recordings are devastating. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Agent Walsh, there's something else. I think my father has been doing this to other people for years. The attacks, the character assassination, the systematic destruction of anyone who threatens him. There might be other victims. We're already investigating those connections. Your case has opened the door to a much larger investigation into how certain wealthy families protect themselves from accountability. You may have exposed an entire network of criminal behavior. That night, my father did exactly what he'd threatened. He released photos of my teenage self-harm scars, medical records for my eating disorder treatment, and even a recording of me crying in a therapist's office at 17. The internet exploded with the most intimate details of my trauma. But something unexpected happened. Instead of turning against me, people rallied harder than ever. Mental health advocates shared their own stories of teenage struggles. Parents talked about how they'd failed to support their children through grief. Survivors of family abuse recognized the pattern of weaponizing someone's mental health history against them. The hashtag #SurvivorNotVictims started trending, with thousands of people sharing their own photos of scars, their treatment records, their stories of overcoming family trauma. And the comments on my father's social media accounts were brutal. People weren't attacking me. They were horrified that a father would exploit his daughter's mental health crisis for personal gain. By morning, my TikTok followers had jumped to 2.8 million, with messages of support pouring in from around the world. Major mental health organizations were asking me to speak at conferences. Netflix was already talking about expanding the documentary series to include the broader conversation about family trauma and healing. My father's final weapon had backfired spectacularly. In trying to destroy me with my own pain, he'd shown the world exactly what kind of man he'd always been. But the real victory came 3 days later, when Agent Walsh called with news that would end his reign of terror forever. We've arrested your father on 14 federal charges, including racketeering, wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. But Meredith, we've also arrested 12 other business owners who were part of the same network. Your story didn't just expose one corrupt businessman. It brought down an entire criminal enterprise. As I watched the news coverage of my father being led away in handcuffs, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete and total vindication. The man who dismissed me as just a cleaner, nothing important, had just learned that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones with the power to destroy you. But this story wasn't over yet, because what happened during his trial would reveal family secrets that would change everything I thought I knew about my own identity. 6 months later, I sat in the front row of federal court in downtown Chicago, watching my father face the consequences of decades of criminal behavior. Richard Hartwell, once the untouchable king of luxury car sales, now looked small and defeated in his orange jumpsuit. The prosecution's case was devastating. They presented evidence of systematic wage theft affecting over 300 employees across 15 years. They showed how he'd manipulated insurance claims to avoid payouts to injured workers. They played Michael Chen's recordings, revealing conversations about bribing safety inspectors and covering up known defects that could have killed customers. But what came out during the trial was far more shocking than any of us had imagined. It started when prosecutor Sarah Williams called Patricia Hartwell to the witness stand. My stepmother, looking frail after her heart attack, took the oath with shaking hands. "Mrs. Hartwell," the prosecutor began, "were you aware of your husband's business practices regarding employee payments?" Patricia glanced at my father, then at me sitting in the gallery. I knew some things weren't right. "Can you be more specific?" "He would bring cash home sometimes. Large amounts. He said it was from sales bonuses, but the amounts never made sense. And he had multiple sets of books, one for taxes, one for the real numbers." "Did you ever question these practices?" Patricia's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Once. In 2015. I asked why he was keeping so much cash at home instead of putting it in the bank. He told me it was none of my business, and if I ever asked again, I'd end up like his first wife." The courtroom went dead silent. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "Mrs. Hartwell, can you clarify what you understood that statement to mean?" I thought he meant divorced. That he'd leave me like he'd left Meredith's mother. But Richard Hartwell's first wife died in a car accident, correct? Patricia's face went white. "Yes, but I thought. He always said." The prosecutor pressed on. "Mrs. Hartwell, Did your husband ever discuss the circumstances of Linda Hartwell's death? Objection. My father's attorney jumped up. This is completely outside the scope of this case. But Judge Morrison overruled. I'll allow it. The witness may answer. Patricia looked terrified now. He said she'd been drinking that night, that she was driving erratically. He said it was her own fault for being careless. But according to the autopsy report, Linda Hartwell had no alcohol in her system. Did you know that? I grabbed the bench in front of me to keep from falling over. My mother hadn't been drinking the night she died. For 11 years, I'd believed she'd gotten drunk and crashed her car. My father had let me carry that guilt, that maybe if I'd been a better daughter, she wouldn't have needed to escape into alcohol. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to show you some documents that were seized from your home during the FBI raid. Do you recognize these insurance papers? Patricia squinted at the documents, her confusion obvious. These are life insurance policies on Linda. But the amounts are, this says $2 million. I thought Richard said she only had a small policy through her job. The prosecutor nodded. Mrs. Hartwell, your husband purchased a $2 million life insurance policy on his first wife just 6 months before her death. Were you aware of this? No, I had no idea. I was shaking so hard I could barely stay in my seat. Rebecca Martinez, who was sitting beside me documenting everything for her follow-up series, grabbed my hand. This changes everything, she whispered. The prosecutor continued her questioning. Mrs. Hartwell, did your husband ever mention having problems with his first wife regarding the business? He said she was asking too many questions about money, that she wanted to see the books, wanted to understand where all the cash was coming from. He said she was threatening to cause problems. What kind of problems? He said she'd found some employee records that upset her. Something about people not getting paid correctly. She wanted him to fix it, and when he refused, she said she was going to report him to the Labor Department. My mother had discovered my father's wage theft 15 years ago. She'd tried to make him do the right thing. And 6 months later, she was dead in a car crash that the police had ruled accidental. But the most shocking revelation came when the prosecutor called Detective Raymond Torres, the original investigating officer from my mother's accident case. Detective Torres, you investigated Linda Hartwell's fatal car accident in 2010. Can you walk us through your findings? Single car accident on a rural road outside the city. Mrs. Hartwell's vehicle left the roadway and struck a tree at high speed. No skid marks, no evidence of braking or attempted steering correction. At the time, what was your conclusion about the cause? Initially, we suspected driver impairment, but toxicology came back clean. No alcohol, no drugs, no medical conditions that would cause sudden incapacitation. It was classified as driver error, but honestly, it never made complete sense. Detective, I'm showing you new evidence that wasn't available during your original investigation. This is documentation of brake line maintenance on Mrs. Hartwell's vehicle from the dealership owned by her husband. What do you notice? Detective Torres studied the papers, his face growing grim. According to these records, the brake lines were worked on just 2 days before the accident. But there's no corresponding work order, no customer signature, no payment record. What would that suggest to you now? That someone tampered with a vehicle without the owner's knowledge or consent. The courtroom erupted. My father's attorney was shouting objections. Patricia was crying. And I was staring at the man who'd raised me, realizing that he wasn't just a white-collar criminal. He might be a murderer. During the lunch recess, I confronted the prosecutor directly. Are you saying my father killed my mother? Sarah Williams looked exhausted. Meredith, we don't have enough evidence to charge him with murder. The car was destroyed after the accident, so we can't examine the brake lines now. But the circumstantial evidence is concerning. A wife who discovers financial crimes, threatens to report them, then dies in a suspicious accident 6 months after her husband takes out a massive life insurance policy on her. Why wasn't this investigated at the time? Because your father was a respected businessman with no criminal record, and the physical evidence was gone. Plus, he was the grieving widower. No one suspected him of anything. That afternoon, I called Agent Walsh with a request that surprised everyone. I want to testify, I told her. Not about the wage theft or the business crimes. I want to testify about what happened after my mother died. About how he used her supposed drinking problem to control and manipulate me. About how he made me believe it was somehow my fault that she was unhappy enough to drink and drive. Meredith, that's incredibly brave, but it's also dangerous. Your testimony could open you up to cross-examination about your own mental health history. Let them try. I'm not the same scared girl I was 6 months ago. And if there's even a chance that my father killed my mother, I want that jury to understand exactly what kind of man he is. 2 days later, I took the witness stand in the same courtroom where I'd learned that everything I believed about my mother's death had been a lie. Ms. Hartwell, the prosecutor began gently, can you tell the jury about your relationship with your mother? She was my best friend. Creative, funny, incredibly kind. She worked part-time at an art gallery and spent her free time volunteering at animal shelters. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and always had time to listen. Did your mother ever seem unhappy or troubled in the months before her death? Yes, but not in the way my father claimed. She was worried about something at his business. She kept asking him questions about money, about employee records she'd seen. She said some of the people working there were being treated unfairly. How did your father respond to her concerns? He got angry. Really angry. He told her it wasn't her business, that she didn't understand how the real world worked. They fought about it constantly. After your mother's death, what did your father tell you about the accident? I looked directly at him, sitting at the defense table with his head down. He told me that she'd been drinking heavily because she was unhappy with her life. That she was a disappointed woman who couldn't handle the pressures of being married to a successful man. He said she'd gotten drunk and crashed the car because she wasn't strong enough to deal with her problems. How did that make you feel? Like it was my fault. Like if I'd been a better daughter, maybe she wouldn't have been so unhappy. I carried that guilt for years, wondering if I could have saved her somehow. Ms. Hartwell, you've now heard testimony that your mother had no alcohol in her system when she died. How does that make you feel about your father's statements? I looked at the jury, then back at my father. It makes me realize that he used my grief and guilt to control me for 11 years. He let me believe that my mother was weak and irresponsible because it served his purposes. He turned her death into a weapon against me. The cross-examination was brutal, but I was ready for it. When my father's attorney tried to paint me as an unreliable narrator with a history of mental health problems, I looked right at the jury and said, yes, I struggled with depression and self-harm as a teenager after my mother died. But that doesn't change the fact that my father lied about how she died, and it doesn't change the documented evidence of his criminal behavior. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman read 14 guilty verdicts that would send my father to federal prison for 18 years. As the bailiff led him away, he looked at me one final time. There was no remorse in his eyes, no regret, just cold hatred for the daughter who'd finally stopped him. That night, I stood outside the courthouse giving interviews to reporters from around the world. But the question that stayed with me came from a young journalist who asked, "What's next for you, Meredith? After everything you've been through, what do you want people to know?" I thought about my mother, about the employees who'd finally gotten justice, about the scared girl I used to be. I want people to know that the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how powerful the people trying to bury it are. And sometimes the person they dismiss as nothing important is exactly the one who has the power to bring them down. But even as I said those words, I knew this story wasn't over. Because 3 days later, I would receive a letter that would reveal the biggest secret of all and give me one final chance at the perfect revenge. 3 days after my father's sentencing, I was back in Los Angeles preparing for the first season of what had become Netflix's most anticipated documentary series. Cleaning House, A Daughter's Fight for Justice, was set to premiere in 6 weeks, with advanced screenings already generating Oscar buzz. I was reviewing the final cut when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Hartwell? This is attorney Margaret Chun with Chun, Williams and Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of your grandmother, Eleanor Hartwell." My heart stopped. My father's mother had died when I was 12, and I'd always been told she'd left everything to him: her house, her investments, her antique jewelry collection that Patricia now wore to charity galas. I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. My grandmother's estate was settled years ago. Actually, Miss Hartwell, that's why I'm calling. We've recently discovered some irregularities in how your grandmother's will was handled. Could you meet with me tomorrow? There are some documents you need to see. The next morning, I sat in Attorney Chen's downtown office, staring at papers that made my head spin. Your grandmother's original will was very specific, Attorney Chen explained. She left the family house and the majority of her estate to you, not to your father. She also included a letter explaining why. She handed me an envelope with my name written in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a 3-page letter dated just weeks before her death. My dearest Meredith, it began, if you are reading this, it means Richard tried to hide this will from you, just as I suspected he would. My hands were shaking as I read on. I've watched my son become someone I don't recognize, cruel, greedy, and completely without conscience. But you, sweet girl, have your mother's heart and your grandfather's strength. That's why I'm leaving you the house on Maple Street and the investment accounts your grandfather built. They're worth approximately $1.8 million. I nearly dropped the letter. My grandmother had left me almost $2 million that I'd never known existed. But more importantly, the letter continued, I'm leaving you the key to safety deposit box 247 at First National Bank. Inside, you'll find documents that prove what I've suspected about your father for years. I pray you'll never need them, but if Richard ever tries to hurt you or anyone else, these papers will stop him. Attorney Chen was watching my face carefully. Ms. Hartwell, your father forged a different will and had it probated instead of the real one. He's been living in your house and spending your inheritance for 14 years. How is that possible? Your grandmother gave the original will to a different attorney, my father actually. When she died, your father claimed she'd changed her mind and produced a different document that left everything to him. My father was suspicious, but had no proof of fraud until recently. What changed? 2 things. First, your father's criminal conviction prompted us to review all his legal dealings. Second, we found your grandmother's safety deposit box, which had been sealed pending resolution of the estate. She left very specific instructions that it should only be opened in your presence. That afternoon, I stood in the vault of First National Bank, holding a key that my grandmother had hidden from my father for 14 years. Inside the safety deposit box was a treasure trove of evidence that made my father's recent conviction look minor. There were photographs of him with known organized crime figures, documents showing he'd been laundering money through the dealerships for over 20 years. Bank records proving he'd stolen from his own mother's accounts while she was dying of cancer. But the most damning evidence was a recorded confession. I knew your grandmother was dying, Attorney Chen explained, but I didn't know she'd hidden a recording device in her hospital room during one of your father's visits. The audio was scratchy but clear enough. My father's voice, talking to someone on the phone while my dying grandmother lay unconscious in her hospital bed. The old woman's got maybe a week left. I've already filed the new will, and Chen's too grief-stricken to question it. By this time next month, everything will be mine, including the money she's been hiding from me. Meredith will never know what hit her. But there was more. And if that little bitch ever tries to cause problems for me like her mother did, I've got contingency plans. The same kind that worked so well with Linda. I had to pause the recording. My father had just confessed, on tape, to murdering my mother. Ms. Hartwell, Attorney Chen said gently, this recording was made 14 years ago, but it's still admissible evidence in a criminal case. Combined with what came out during the federal trial, this could reopen your mother's death investigation. That night, I called Agent Walsh with the evidence. Within hours, the FBI was coordinating with Chicago police to reopen my mother's murder case as a federal investigation. But I also made another call to Diana at Netflix. We need to add another episode to the series, I told her, because this story just got a whole lot bigger. 2 weeks later, as my father sat in federal prison appealing his conviction, He received a visit from FBI agents with a warrant for his arrest on charges of first-degree murder and inheritance fraud. I wasn't there, but I heard from his attorney that when they read him the charges, his exact words were, "That clever little bitch actually found it." Even facing a murder charge, he couldn't bring himself to show me an ounce of respect. The Netflix documentary premiered 3 months later to massive critical acclaim and ratings that broke streaming records. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about wage theft, family abuse, and the ways powerful people silence their victims. The day after the premiere, I got a call that made everything worthwhile. "Meredith? This is Carmen Rodriguez. I just wanted to thank you." Carmen was one of the employees who'd testified against my father. She'd been fired for reporting sexual harassment and had been struggling to find work ever since. "The documentary opened doors I never expected," she continued. "3 different companies have reached out offering me management positions. But more than that, my teenage daughter watched it with me last night, and she said she finally understood why I fought so hard even when it seemed hopeless." Similar calls came in throughout the week. James Washington had started his own auto repair business, with support from viewers who'd been inspired by his story. Sarah Kim had been hired by a law firm specializing in employment rights. Even Michael Chun had been approached about turning his experience into a book about corporate whistleblowing. But the most meaningful message came from someone I'd never expected to hear from again. Patricia had filed for divorce from my father the day after his murder arrest. Her message was simple. "Meredith, I know I don't deserve forgiveness for the years I enabled his behavior. But I want you to know that watching you find your strength gave me the courage to finally leave. I'm in therapy now, trying to understand how I became someone who could ignore so much cruelty. I'm sorry doesn't feel like enough, but it's where I have to start." The house on Maple Street that my grandmother had left me became the headquarters for the Hartwell Foundation, a nonprofit organization supporting employees who speak out against workplace abuse. The $1.8 million inheritance funded legal aid, counseling services, and emergency financial support for people facing retaliation. My father's murder trial was scheduled for the following spring, but his attorney was already floating plea deal offers. Even with his arrogance, he apparently understood that a jury hearing about systematic employee abuse, insurance fraud, and spousal murder wasn't likely to show mercy. Vivian had reached out a few times, mostly to complain about how the scandal had affected her social status and her husband's business connections. She seemed genuinely shocked that I wasn't interested in helping her rehabilitate the family image. "But we're still family," she'd said during our last conversation. "No," I'd replied. "We're related. Family doesn't steal from each other, lie to each other, or try to destroy each other's lives. Family protects and supports each other. We've never been that." 6 months after the documentary premiered, I was standing in my grandmother's house, my house now, looking at the wall of photos she'd kept of me throughout my childhood. Pictures my father had told me she never wanted to see, memories he'd claimed she didn't care about. In every photo, I could see the love in her eyes, the pride in her smile. She'd been watching over me even when I'd thought I was completely alone. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Martinez. "Murder charges officially filed today. Full confession in exchange for life without parole instead of death penalty. It's over, Meredith. You won." I'd won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like justice. For my mother, for Carmen and James and Sarah, and everyone else who'd been crushed under my father's need for control and wealth. That night, I posted one final TikTok video from my grandmother's kitchen. "Hey everyone, it's been quite a journey since that wedding video went viral. I've learned a lot about family, justice, and what happens when you finally stop letting people make you feel small." I paused, looking directly into the camera. If you're watching this and someone in your life is making you feel like you're nothing important, I want you to know something. They're wrong. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And sometimes, the people who try to silence you are the ones with the most to hide. I looked at the photo of my mother on the mantelpiece, the one where she was laughing and holding me as a toddler. This series started with a father dismissing his daughter as just a cleaner. But what he learned, what everyone learned, is that the people you underestimate are often the ones with the power to clean house in ways you never saw coming. The final shot was me walking through the front door of my house, finally coming home to a place where I belonged. But this story has one more chapter, because what happened during my father's sentencing hearing would give me the closure I'd been seeking my entire life. The day of my father's murder sentencing was gray and cold, with that bone-deep chill that seems to seep through Chicago's downtown courthouse walls and into your soul. I hadn't planned to attend. My therapist had advised against it, saying I'd already gotten the justice I needed. But something pulled me there, a need to see this chapter close with my own eyes. The courtroom was packed with reporters, former employees, and family members of other victims. Carmen Rodriguez sat 3 rows behind me. James Washington had flown in from Phoenix. Even Michael Chun was there, having become something of a celebrity himself after testifying in multiple corruption cases inspired by our investigation. When they brought my father in, I barely recognized him. Prison had aged him 20 years in 18 months. His hair was completely gray now, his face gaunt, his expensive suits replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his diminished frame. But when his eyes met mine across the courtroom, the hatred was still there, burning as bright as ever. Judge Morrison reviewed the plea agreement with the clinical precision that major criminal cases demand. Life in prison without the possibility of parole in exchange for his confession to first-degree murder in my mother's death. Additional consecutive sentences for the inheritance fraud, ensuring he would die behind bars even if the murder conviction was somehow overturned. Mr. Hartwell, Judge Morrison said, "Before I accept this plea agreement, I want to make sure you understand what you're admitting to. You're confessing that you deliberately tampered with your wife's vehicle, causing her death, in order to prevent her from reporting your business crimes and to collect on the life insurance policy you'd purchased. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was barely a whisper. "And you understand that by accepting this agreement, you're also admitting to defrauding your own daughter of her inheritance and spending money that legally belonged to her for over a decade?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Morrison looked at me in the gallery. "Ms. Hartwell, the court recognizes that you are the victim of multiple crimes committed by the defendant. Would you like to make a victim impact statement before sentencing?" I hadn't prepared anything. I'd told myself I was just there to observe. But standing up in that courtroom, looking at the man who destroyed so many lives, I realized I had something to say after all. "Your Honor, for most of my life, I believed that my father was a successful businessman who'd made some mistakes, but ultimately loved his family. Even after I discovered his business crimes, part of me still hoped we could rebuild some kind of relationship." I looked directly at him. But learning that he murdered my mother, and then spent 11 years letting me believe it was her fault, showed me who he really is. He's not a man who made bad choices under pressure. He's someone who decided other people's lives were acceptable sacrifices for his comfort and reputation. My voice grew stronger as I continued. He stole my mother's life. He stole my inheritance. He stole 11 years of grieving properly for my mother because I was too busy feeling guilty about her supposed drinking problem. He stole wages from hundreds of employees, some of whom are sitting in this courtroom today. I paused, watching him carefully. But he also gave me something, though he never intended to. He taught me exactly who I don't want to be. And when he dismissed me as just a cleaner, nothing important, he gave me the motivation to prove that everyone, regardless of their job, their background, or their relationship to powerful people, deserves respect and justice. Judge Morrison nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell." Then came the moment I'd been waiting for without even knowing it. As part of the sentencing process, my father was required to make a statement acknowledging his crimes and their impact. He stood slowly, his shackles clanking against the defendant's table. For a moment, he looked like the broken old man he'd become. But when he spoke, his voice carried the same arrogance that had defined him my entire life. "Your Honor, I want to state for the record that while I accept responsibility for my actions, I believe the media attention and public persecution my daughter orchestrated was disproportionate to my crimes." I felt my blood pressure spike, but I stayed quiet. "I provided for my family," he continued, "and yes, I made some business decisions that hurt people. But the way this case has been sensationalized, The way my daughter has profited from destroying our family's reputation suggests that her motivations weren't entirely pure. Even facing life in prison, he couldn't resist attacking me one more time. Judge Morrison's face darkened. Mr. Hartwell, this court is not interested in your opinions about your daughter's motivations. We are here because you murdered your wife and defrauded dozens of people over decades of criminal behavior. Do you have anything to say to the victims of your crimes, or shall we proceed to sentencing? My father looked around the courtroom, his eyes settling on the former employees, then on me. For just a moment, I thought I saw something that might have been regret. I'm sorry, he said finally. I'm sorry to the families I hurt. I'm sorry to the employees I cheated. And I'm sorry to Meredith for the childhood I gave her. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I'd ever gotten from him, but it felt hollow, performative. Too little, too late. Judge Morrison delivered the sentence with the weight of finality. Life in prison without parole, plus consecutive terms totaling 45 years for the financial crimes. Richard Hartwell would die behind bars. As the bailiff led him away, my father turned back one last time. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and in that moment, I saw something I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Not of prison or death, but of being forgotten. Of having his legacy be nothing more than a cautionary tale about greed and cruelty. Meredith, he called out, his voice cracking. Meredith, But the bailiff had already pulled him through the door, and whatever final words he wanted to say were lost forever. Outside the courthouse, I was surrounded by reporters asking how I felt about the sentencing, whether I had closure, what my plans were moving forward. But I barely heard them. I was thinking about something my therapist had told me months earlier. Healing isn't about getting revenge, Dr. Sarah Chin had said. It's about reaching a point where the person who hurt you no longer has any power over your happiness or sense of self-worth. Standing on those courthouse steps, watching the media frenzy around my family's destruction, I realized I'd finally reached that point. My father's opinion of me, whether he saw me as successful or worthless, important or invisible, simply didn't matter anymore. That evening, I was back in my grandmother's house, sitting in the kitchen where she'd once taught me to make her famous chocolate chip cookies. My phone was buzzing with interview requests and congratulatory messages, but I ignored them all. Instead, I called Diana at Netflix. It's done, I told her. He's going to die in prison. How do you feel? I considered the question carefully. Empty, mostly. Not sad, not happy. Just empty. Like I've been carrying this weight for so long that I forgot it was there, and now that it's gone, I don't know what to do with the space it left behind. That's normal, Diana said. You've spent 2 years of your life fighting this battle. Now you get to figure out who you are when you're not fighting. She was right. For the first time since I was 16 years old, I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. I didn't have to overcome my father's expectations or live down his dismissal. I was free to simply be myself. 3 months later, I was standing in the warehouse space that would become the new headquarters for Clean Slate Industries, the cleaning and restoration company I'd started with the Netflix money. But this wasn't just another cleaning service. We hired exclusively from populations that traditional businesses overlooked: formerly incarcerated individuals, people recovering from addiction, immigrants struggling with language barriers, and anyone else who'd been written off by society. We paid living wages, provided full health care, and offered profit sharing to every employee. If someone judges you by your worst moment or your current circumstances, I told our first training class, they don't understand that everyone deserves a second chance to show who they really are. Carmen Rodriguez was now my operations manager, having discovered a talent for logistics and employee relations that her previous employers had never bothered to notice. James Washington ran our automotive restoration division, specializing in classic cars that other shops wouldn't touch. Sarah Kim headed our financial department, ensuring that every employee got every penny they'd earned, a mission that had become personal for her after years of working for my father. But the moment that really showed me how far we'd all come happened 6 months after my father's sentencing, when I got a call from an unexpected source. Meredith? This is Vivian. I need help. My half-sister's voice was shaky, uncertain. My husband left me last month. He said the scandal around Dad had ruined his business relationships, and he couldn't handle being associated with our family anymore. I waited, unsure how to respond. I'm losing the house, she continued. I've never worked a real job, never learned how to budget or pay bills, or do any of the things normal people do. I don't have any skills, and no one wants to hire someone with the Hartwell name anymore. There was a long pause before she added, I know I don't deserve your help after everything that happened, but I don't know where else to turn. Part of me wanted to hang up. Vivian had stood by silently while my father destroyed me for years. She'd enjoyed the lifestyle built on stolen wages while I scraped by cleaning other people's toilets. She'd made it clear that I was unwelcome at her wedding unless I was working as unpaid help. But I thought about the scared girl underneath all that privilege, someone who'd been raised to believe her worth came entirely from her father's money and her husband's status. Someone who was about to learn the same lesson I had about being dismissed and overlooked by people who were supposed to love her. Vivian, I said finally, if you're serious about wanting to change your life, I'll give you a chance. But it won't be charity. You'll work for every dollar you earn, and you'll start at the bottom like everyone else. I'll do anything, she said quickly. I just want a chance to prove I can be better than I was. 2 weeks later, Vivian Hartwell, former trust fund princess and country club queen, showed up at Clean Slate Industries in jeans and sneakers, ready to learn how to clean office buildings and strip tile floors. She was terrible at it initially, soft hands blistering from unfamiliar work, complaining about the early hours and physical demands. But she kept showing up, day after day, week after week, slowly building calluses and muscles, and something that looked like genuine humility. I never realized how hard this work was, she told me after her first month. All those years, watching you clean, I thought it was because you couldn't do anything else. I didn't understand that it requires skill and stamina and problem solving. I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to see that. It wasn't a complete transformation. Vivian still had moments of entitled frustration, still struggled with taking direction from people she'd once considered beneath her notice. But she was trying, genuinely trying, to become someone worthy of the second chance she'd been given. A year later, Clean Slate Industries had grown to employ over 200 people across 3 states. We were getting contracts with major corporations who wanted to partner with companies that prioritized social responsibility. The Netflix documentary had been nominated for an Emmy and had sparked similar investigations into family-owned businesses across the country. But the success that meant the most to me wasn't measured in revenue or awards. It was the thank you notes I received from employees who'd found stability and respect for the first time in years. It was the progress reports from formerly homeless workers who'd saved enough money to rent apartments. It was watching Vivian slowly discover that her worth wasn't tied to her last name or her bank account. On the 2-year anniversary of that viral wedding video, I was sitting in my office when Carmen knocked on the door. "Boss, there's someone here to see you," says he's a reporter working on a follow-up story. The young man who walked into my office looked nervous, but determined. "Ms. Hartwell? I'm David Martinez with the Chicago Tribune. Rebecca Martinez is my aunt. She's the one who helped expose your father's crimes." I smiled. "Journalism runs in the family?" "Apparently. Aunt Rebecca told me about your company and what you're doing here. I'm working on a series about businesses that are proving you can be profitable while still treating workers fairly. Would you be willing to be interviewed?" As I prepared to tell my story once again, I thought about that broken girl who'd cleaned toilets at her half-sister's wedding while her father dismissed her as nothing important. She could never have imagined that her lowest moment would become the catalyst for everything that followed. The interview went well, and as David was packing up his equipment, he asked me one final question that caught me off guard. "Ms. Hartwell, if you could go back and change what happened at that wedding, if you could have had the family relationship you always wanted instead of going through all this pain, would you?" I thought about my mother, finally getting justice after 14 years. I thought about the hundreds of employees who'd been made whole. I thought about Clean Slate Industries and all the lives we'd managed to rebuild. I thought about the girl I used to be, desperate for her father's approval, and the woman I'd become, someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to know her own worth. No, I said finally. I wouldn't change any of it. Because that moment taught me the most important lesson of my life. Sometimes the people who try to make you feel small are actually showing you just how powerful you really are. As David left, I looked out my office window at the warehouse floor below, where dozens of people were working with dignity and purpose, many of them getting their first real chance at stability in years. My father had been right about one thing: I was just a cleaner. But he'd been catastrophically wrong about everything else. I wasn't nothing important. I was exactly important enough to clean house in ways he never saw coming. And that made all the difference. 5 years after that wedding video went viral, I stood on the stage at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., accepting the Presidential Medal of Freedom for my work in employment advocacy and criminal justice reform. The ceremony was surreal. Just a few feet away sat senators, Supreme Court justices, and business leaders whose names I'd only seen in newspapers. But the moment that really struck me came when President Williams spoke about my journey during the presentation. Meredith Hartwell reminds us that sometimes the voices society overlooks are exactly the ones we need to hear most clearly. Her courage in speaking truth to power didn't just bring one criminal to justice. It inspired a national movement that has recovered over $200 million in stolen wages for American workers. $200 million. That number still took my breath away. What had started with my father's 3 dealerships had exploded into the largest workplace crime investigation in U.S. history. Rebecca Martinez's reporting had exposed a network of over 400 businesses using similar tactics to exploit employees. The FBI had created an entire task force dedicated to investigating what they dubbed dynasty crimes, criminal enterprises run by powerful families who believed their wealth made them untouchable. Clean Slate Industries now operated in 12 states, employing over 2,000 people who'd been written off by traditional businesses. We'd partnered with the Department of Labor to create the Second Chance Employment Initiative, providing job training and placement services for anyone struggling to find work due to criminal records, addiction history, or other barriers. But the personal transformation that meant the most to me wasn't mine. It was Vivian's. My half-sister now managed our Los Angeles operation, having worked her way up from entry-level cleaner to regional supervisor over 4 years of genuine effort. She'd married a social worker she'd met at a company volunteer event, someone who loved her for who she was becoming rather than who she'd been born as. "I know you probably thought I'd quit after the first week," she said during her promotion ceremony. "Honestly, I thought I would too. But working here taught me something I'd never learned in 30 years of privilege. Self-respect isn't something you inherit or marry into. It's something you earn by treating other people with dignity and doing work that matters." The audience, mostly Clean Slate employees who'd watched her transformation, gave her a standing ovation. Later, she pulled me aside with tears in her eyes. "I need to tell you something I should have said years ago," she whispered. "At my wedding, when Dad said you were just a cleaner, nothing important, I knew it was wrong. I knew you were struggling and deserved better. But I was so worried about my perfect day being disrupted that I just let it happen." She took a shaky breath. "I've replayed that moment 1,000 times, wondering what would have changed if I'd just stood up and said, 'She's my sister, and she's important to me.' Maybe none of the rest would have been necessary." I hugged her tightly. "Vivian, if you defended me that day, I might never have found the strength to expose Dad's crimes. Those 2,000 people working for us now, the hundreds of millions recovered for cheated employees, the families who got justice, maybe none of that happens if I don't hit rock bottom first." "So you're saying my selfishness accidentally saved the world?" she asked with a watery laugh. "I'm saying sometimes our worst moments lead to our greatest purposes." The reception after the Medal of Freedom ceremony was attended by everyone who'd been part of the journey. Carmen Rodriguez brought her daughter, who is now studying labor law at Georgetown. James Washington flew in with his wife and twin boys, who kept asking if I was really famous like on TV. Michael Chen had written a best-selling book about corporate whistleblowing and was there with his literary agent, discussing movie rights. Even Patricia showed up, having spent the past 5 years in therapy and volunteer work, trying to make amends for the decades she'd enabled my father's cruelty. She donated her entire divorce settlement to the Hartwell Foundation and now worked as a counselor for other women escaping abusive relationships. I know I can never undo the years I stood by and watched him tear you down, she told me. But I want you to know that seeing you rebuild your life gave me the courage to rebuild mine. I'm proud of the woman you became despite everything we did to try to break you. But the most meaningful moment came when a young woman approached me near the end of the evening. Miss Hartwell? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm Jessica Liu, and I wanted to thank you. I didn't recognize her, but she looked familiar in a way I couldn't place. 2 years ago, I was working 3 jobs to support my disabled mother, and all 3 employers were stealing my overtime pay. I saw your documentary and learned about the Department of Labor hotline you'd helped establish. When I reported them, they fired me immediately and tried to blacklist me from other positions. My heart sank, fearing this was another story of retaliation I hadn't been able to prevent. But then Clean Slate Industries hired me for your Denver location, she continued, her face lighting up. Not only did I get a job that paid fairly, but your legal team helped me file suit against my previous employers. We won a settlement that covered my mom's medical bills and allowed me to go back to school. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of herself in a graduation cap and gown. I graduated last month with a degree in social work. I start my job with the Colorado Department of Labor next week, investigating workplace abuse cases. Jessica, that's incredible. But why do you look familiar?
She grinned.
Because I was one of the servers at your sister's wedding 5 years ago. I was working that event as my second job that day. I remember thinking how cruel your father was to dismiss you like that, but I was too scared of losing the catering gig to say anything. The full circle moment hit me like lightning. So the woman who's now going to be protecting other workers from exploitation was there the night this all started? Not just there, Jessica said. I was one of the people who shared your TikTok video that first night. I knew that if someone with your family connections was brave enough to speak out, maybe the rest of us had a chance too. As the evening wound down, I found myself alone on the Kennedy Center balcony, looking out over the Potomac River and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw you on the news tonight. Congratulations on the medal. You turned out better than any of us deserved. RH. My father, somehow managing to send a message from federal prison. After 5 years of no contact, he'd chosen tonight to reach out. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. He'd lost the right to comment on my life the day he dismissed me as nothing important. His opinion, positive or negative, simply didn't matter anymore. Instead, I called the person whose opinion had always mattered most. Hi, Mom, I said aloud, looking up at the stars. I hope you can see this. I hope you know that everything Dad tried to hide about what happened to you came to light. I hope you're proud of who I became. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves on the trees along the river, and for a moment it almost felt like an answer. 6 months later, I was back in Chicago for the opening of the Hartwell Foundation's new headquarters, a gleaming building in the heart of downtown that housed legal aid services, job training programs, and counseling services for workplace abuse survivors. The dedication ceremony was attended by Secretary of Labor Patricia Velasquez, who'd made workplace crime enforcement a cornerstone of the administration's domestic policy agenda. The Hartwell Foundation represents something uniquely American, Secretary Velasquez said in her remarks. The idea that anyone, regardless of their background or circumstances, can find the strength to stand up for justice, and that standing up can change not just their own life, but thousands of others. As I cut the ribbon on the new building, I thought about that scared, angry girl who'd once stood in a country club bathroom, cleaning toilets while her family celebrated without her. She'd felt so small, so invisible, so worthless. If I could go back and tell her anything, it would be this. You're not nothing important. You're everything important. And someday the whole world is going to know it. The final surprise came that evening when Vivian presented me with a gift that made me cry in front of 500 people. It was our grandmother's recipe box, the one I thought had been lost after she died. Inside was every cookie recipe, cake recipe, and family cooking secret Eleanor Hartwell had collected over 70 years of life. I found this in Mom's storage unit when she moved, Vivian explained. Dad had hidden it there along with all of Grandma's photos of you. I think she would have wanted you to have it. That night, back in my grandmother's kitchen, my kitchen now, I made her chocolate chip cookies using her original recipe. As the familiar smell filled the house, I felt a peace I'd been seeking my entire adult life. I'd spent so many years trying to prove I was worth something to people who'd already decided I wasn't. But the real victory wasn't changing their minds. It was realizing I never needed their approval in the first place. My worth wasn't determined by my job title, my bank account, or my family's opinion of me. It was determined by how I treated other people, how I used my second chances, and whether I made the world a little bit better for the time I was in it. As I packed the cookies to take to the clean slate offices the next morning, a tradition I'd started to remind everyone that success should always be shared, I thought about all the lives that had been changed by one moment of courage in a country club ballroom. Sometimes the people who try to make you feel invisible are actually giving you a superpower. Because when you're invisible to the powerful, you can see all their secrets, document all their crimes, and expose all their lies before they even realize you're a threat. My father had called me just a cleaner, nothing important. He was right about the first part. I was a cleaner. I cleaned house in ways he never saw coming. And I'm still not done cleaning. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told you're not important enough to matter, I want you to remember something. They're wrong about you just like they were wrong about me. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the one who has the power to change everything. Hit that subscribe button if the story inspired you, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what dreams you're building that other people might be trying to tear down. Because the next time someone tries to dismiss you as nothing important, you'll know exactly what I know. You're everything important, and you're just getting started.